On the night of September 26, 1983, inside a concrete bunker buried beneath frozen soil near Serpukhov 15, a Soviet lieutenant colonel named Stanislav Petrov stared at a red warning light that should not have been blinking. The light meant one thing. 5 American intercontinental ballistic missiles were crossing the Arctic, headed for Soviet cities. The computer was certain, the protocol was clear, and the decision was his. He had 12 minutes to report it to Moscow. 12 minutes before the Soviet Union would launch everything it had in retaliation. 12 minutes before the world ended. But Stanislav Petrov did something no officer was trained to do. He lied. He told his superiors it was a false alarm, even though every system in that bunker screamed otherwise. Even though the red lights kept blinking. Even though his career, his freedom, and possibly his life depended on following the rules. He chose doubt over duty. And by doing so, he prevented a nuclear war that would have killed hundreds of millions of people in less than an hour. But the Soviet Union did not thank him. They buried him. This is the story of the man who saved the world and was punished for it. The world that built the bunker. To understand what happened that night, you need to understand the world that built places like Serpukhov 15. By 1983, the Cold War had been raging for nearly 4 decades. It was not a war of trenches and tanks. It was a war of paranoia, silence, and machines designed to destroy continents in minutes. 2 superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, stood facing each other across invisible lines, each armed with enough nuclear weapons to extinguish civilization several times over. The doctrine was called mutually assured destruction, MAD for short. The logic was grotesque but simple. If one side launched, the other would launch immediately in response. No one could win. Everyone would die. And so the theory went, no one would ever push the button. But that theory rested on one terrifying assumption, that every human link in the chain of command would act rationally, calmly, and without error, even when the world was ending around them. In 1983, that assumption was being tested like never before. Earlier that year, President Ronald Reagan had called the Soviet Union an evil empire in a speech that electrified and horrified the world. The rhetoric was not just political theater. It reflected a genuine escalation in tensions. The United States was deploying new Pershing II missiles in West Germany, missiles that could reach Moscow in less than 10 minutes. The Soviets, in turn, were positioning SS-20 missiles across Eastern Europe, aimed at every NATO capital. Both sides were building weapons faster than diplomats could talk. Both sides were spying on each other with satellites, submarines, and sleeper agents planted in foreign cities. And both sides were terrified. The Soviet leadership, aging and isolated inside the Kremlin, believed the Americans were preparing a first strike, a surprise nuclear attack disguised as a military exercise. The Americans, watching Soviet troop movements and missile deployments, believed the Soviets were becoming desperate and unpredictable. Trust had evaporated. In its place was a system of early warning radars, satellite sensors, and underground command centers staffed by men and women trained to make the worst decision in human history, if the data told them to. Serpukhov 15 was one of those places. It was not marked on any public map. It had no official name. Locals called it the bunker, but even they did not know what happened inside. The facility was part of the Soviet Union's OKO early warning system, a network of satellites and ground stations designed to detect American missile launches the moment they left their silos. The bunker itself was a Cold War cathedral, reinforced concrete walls 10 feet thick, blast doors that could seal in seconds, and rows of computer terminals glowing green in the dim fluorescent light. The air inside smelled like old cigarettes, machine oil, and recycled ventilation. The temperature was kept cold to protect the equipment, not the people. The men who worked there wore Soviet air defense uniforms and spoke in clipped, disciplined tones. They were not politicians or philosophers. They were technicians, operators, believers in the system. Their job was simple: watch the screen, trust the machine, and report what it showed. Stanislav Petrov was the duty officer that night. He was 44 years old, tall and thin, with tired eyes and the kind of face that had stopped smiling years ago. He had spent most of his career in the Soviet military, working with satellites and early warning technology. He was good at his job, precise, methodical, and loyal. But he was not a fanatic. He had a wife and a young son waiting for him in a cramped apartment in Moscow. He loved engineering more than ideology. And though he believed in the Soviet system, he also knew its flaws. The bureaucratic paranoia, the culture of fear, the way good men disappeared for asking the wrong questions. Still, he followed orders. He always had. Until that night. The shift. Stanislav arrived at Serpukhov 15 just before midnight on September 25th. His shift would last until morning. It was supposed to be routine. The bunker hummed with the low, steady noise of machines breathing. Radar operators sat at their stations, eyes fixed on glowing green monitors. The walls were lined with maps of the Northern Hemisphere, covered in circles and grids that marked missile trajectories and detection zones. A large red telephone sat on a metal desk near the back, the direct line to Soviet military command in Moscow. No one touched that phone unless the world was ending. Stanislav poured himself a cup of bitter black tea from a steel thermos and reviewed the night's reports. There had been increased NATO activity over the past few days, training exercises, they said, but the Soviets did not believe in coincidences. Tension was high, but nothing unusual. At 0:15 hours, the night was quiet. By 0:16, everything had changed. A piercing alarm shattered the silence. Red lights began flashing across the main console. The computer screen displayed a message in bold Cyrillic letters. Missile launch detected. Stanislav felt his chest tighten. He stood and moved quickly to the terminal. Around him, other operators froze, waiting for confirmation. The system identified the launch site, somewhere in the United States. Trajectory, Soviet Union. Number of missiles, 1. Stanislav's training kicked in. He checked the satellite data, cross-referenced the radar feeds, and waited for secondary confirmation. The protocol was clear. If the system detected a launch, he was required to immediately report it to Moscow. From there, the decision would escalate to the General Staff, and from there, to the Kremlin. The clock was ticking, but something felt wrong. One missile. Why would the Americans launch only one missile? If the United States was going to start a nuclear war, they would not fire a single warhead. They would fire everything at once. Hundreds of missiles, launched simultaneously to overwhelm Soviet defenses. That was the doctrine. That was the plan both sides had wargamed for decades. A single missile made no strategic sense, unless it was a test, or a mistake, or a malfunction. Stanislav hesitated, and then, before he could make a decision, the alarm sounded again. Second missile launch detected, then a third, then a fourth, then a fifth. The screen now showed 5 American ICBMs in flight, all headed toward Soviet territory. The room went silent. Every operator turned to look at Stanislav. He was the senior officer on duty. The decision was his. The protocol was unambiguous. He was supposed to pick up the red phone and report a missile attack. Once he did that, the Soviet Union's nuclear forces would be placed on high alert. Bomber crews would scramble. Submarine commanders would prepare to launch. And within minutes, Soviet ICBMs would be rising from their silos, arcing over the North Pole, and descending on American cities. Retaliation would be automatic. The world would end because of a phone call. But Stanislav did not pick up the phone. He stared at the screen, his mind racing. 5 missiles, not 50, not 500, 5. It still did not make sense. If this was a real American first strike, there should be hundreds of launches, enough to destroy Soviet command and control before they could respond. 5 missiles could not do that. 5 missiles could not win a nuclear war, unless the system was wrong. The Soviet Oko satellite network was new. It had only been operational for a few years, and Stanislav knew it had bugs. He had worked on the technology himself. He knew the satellites used infrared sensors to detect the heat signatures of missile launches, and he knew those sensors could be fooled by sunlight reflecting off clouds, by high-altitude weather phenomena, even by the angle of the satellite's orbit. He had seen false positives before, never like this, but it was possible. And yet, if he was wrong, if this was real, and he did nothing, the Soviet Union would be defenseless. Millions would die, and he would be the man who let it happen. His hand hovered near the red phone. His heart pounded, and then he made the call, not to Moscow, but to the satellite operators monitoring the infrared feeds. He demanded they double-check the data. He asked them if there was any visual confirmation from ground-based radar. He searched for any piece of evidence that could prove the missiles were real. The operators gave him nothing. The satellites showed the launches. The computers confirmed them. But ground radar, which should have picked up the missiles within minutes, showed nothing. No missiles, no contrails, no radar signatures, just empty sky. Stanislav took a breath. He walked to the red phone, lifted the receiver, and called Moscow. When the officer on the other end answered, Stanislav said the words that would define the rest of his life. False alarm. The silence that followed. For the next several minutes, the bunker held its breath. The alarm continued to flash. The computer continued to insist the missiles were real, but Stanislav stood by his assessment. He told Moscow the system had malfunctioned. He said the satellite data was unreliable. He recommended they wait for ground radar confirmation before escalating. Moscow did not sound convinced, but they trusted him enough to hold off on a full-scale alert. And then slowly, the red light stopped blinking. The system reset. The screen went dark, and no missiles ever appeared on ground radar, because there were no missiles. Stanislav had been right. The satellite sensors had mistaken sunlight reflecting off high-altitude clouds for the heat signature of rocket engines. It was a glitch, a coincidence of angle, altitude, and timing. The kind of error that should have been caught by redundant systems, but wasn't. The kind of error that on any other night, with any other officer, could have started World War III. But that night, in that bunker, Stanislav Petrov had chosen doubt over certainty. He had broken protocol. He had lied to his superiors, and he had saved the world. The cost of doubt. You might think Stanislav Petrov became a hero after that night. He did not. The Soviet military launched an internal investigation almost immediately. They wanted to know why he had hesitated, why he had not followed procedure, why he had questioned the system. The fact that he had been correct did not matter. What mattered was that he had deviated from protocol. He had made a judgment call in a system designed to eliminate judgment. He had inserted doubt into a machine built on absolute certainty. And in the Soviet Union, doubt was dangerous. The investigation was quiet but thorough. Officers questioned him for hours, reviewing every decision he made that night, every second of hesitation, every deviation from the manual. They accused him of cowardice. They suggested he had been afraid to make the hard call. They implied he might have been compromised. Stanislav told them the truth. The data did not make sense. The number of missiles was wrong. The ground radar showed nothing. He had used his training and his experience to assess the situation, exactly as he had been taught. But the truth did not matter. What mattered was obedience. In the end, the military did not punish him officially. They did not court-martial him or send him to prison. But they made sure he would never advance. He was quietly reassigned. His career stalled. His name was removed from commendations. He was never promoted again. By 1984, less than a year after the incident, Stanislav Petrov had been effectively erased from the system he had spent his life serving. He retired early, citing health problems. He moved to a small apartment outside Moscow and lived on a modest military pension. He rarely spoke about what happened that night. When journalists eventually found him, decades later, he gave brief, reluctant interviews. He did not call himself a hero. He said he had simply done his job. But the Soviet Union never acknowledged him. Even after the Cold War ended, even after the files were declassified, the Russian government offered no apology, no recognition, no gratitude. Stanislav Petrov saved the world, and the world forgot him. The machinery of fear. To understand why the Soviet Union punished Stanislav Petrov instead of honoring him, you need to understand what the Cold War did to the people who fought it. The Cold War was not won or lost on battlefields. It was fought inside minds, in the space between loyalty and survival, between truth and obedience. It created systems where human beings became components, expected to function without hesitation, without question, and without mercy. The Soviet military was one of those systems. It was built on the principle that the individual did not matter. What mattered was the collective, the mission, the state. A soldier's job was not to think, it was to execute. Doubt was weakness. Hesitation was betrayal. and anyone who broke the chain of command for any reason became a liability. Stanislav Petrov had broken that chain. He had inserted his own judgment into a moment designed to be automatic. He had questioned the machine. And even though his judgment had been correct, the fact that he had made the choice at all was unforgivable. Because if one officer could doubt the system, so could another. And the entire structure of deterrence, the entire logic of mutually assured destruction, depended on the enemy believing that retaliation would be swift, certain, and mechanical. If the Americans knew that Soviet officers might hesitate, might question, might refuse to launch, then the whole illusion collapsed. So the Soviet military did what it always did with uncomfortable truths. It buried them. Stanislav's name was quietly scrubbed from official reports. The incident at Serpukhov 15 was classified at the highest level, and the few people who knew what really happened that night were told, implicitly and explicitly, never to speak of it. The system protected itself, and Stanislav Petrov became a ghost. The life after Stanislav spent the rest of the 1980s trying to disappear. He moved to a small town called Fryazino, about 25 kilometers northeast of Moscow. It was a quiet place, unremarkable, the kind of town where retired military officers went to fade into obscurity. He lived in a modest apartment with his wife, Raisa, and tried to build a life outside the system that had discarded him. But the weight of what he had done, and what had been done to him, never left. His marriage began to fracture. Raisa did not understand why he had been forced out of the military. She did not know the details of that night in September, and Stanislav could not tell her. The silence between them grew. By the early 1990s, as the Soviet Union itself began to collapse, so did their relationship. Raisa died in 1997. Stanislav rarely spoke about her after that. He lived alone. He survived on a military pension that barely covered his expenses. His apartment was small and cold in the winter. He grew vegetables in a patch of dirt behind the building. He fixed broken electronics for neighbors to earn a little extra money. He read engineering textbooks and listened to classical music on an old radio. He did not watch the news. He did not follow politics. He wanted nothing to do with the world he had saved. For nearly 2 decades, Stanislav Petrov lived in anonymity. The world moved on. The Berlin Wall fell. The Soviet Union dissolved. The Cold War ended, and a new generation grew up never knowing how close they had come to annihilation. And then, in the late 1990s, someone found him. A Danish filmmaker named Peter Anthony was researching the history of nuclear near misses for a documentary. He had heard rumors about an incident in 1983, something involving a Soviet early warning system and a decision not to launch. He spent months digging through declassified files, interviewing former Soviet military officers, and following leads that went nowhere, until he found a name, Stanislav Petrov. Anthony tracked him down to Fryazino and knocked on his door. At first, Stanislav refused to talk. He said he was nobody. He said the story was not important. He said he had done nothing special. But Anthony kept coming back. And eventually, slowly, Stanislav began to tell the story. Not because he wanted recognition, not because he thought he was a hero, but because he realized that the world needed to know how fragile everything had been. The man who lived in the cracks. When the story finally broke in the early 2000s, the international reaction was one of quiet shock. News outlets across the world ran articles about the man who saved the world. Stanislav was invited to the United Nations. He received awards from peace organizations. He traveled to the United States and was honored by military historians and nuclear policy experts who called him a hero. But Stanislav himself seemed uncomfortable with the attention. In interviews, he spoke softly, carefully, as if every word might be held against him. He did not glorify what he had done. He did not claim to have made a brave moral choice. He said, over and over, that he had simply been doing his job, assessing the data, using his training, making the best decision he could with the information he had. I was just at the right place at the right time, he said in one interview. Or maybe the wrong place. I don't know. He was asked many times if he considered himself a hero. He always said no. A hero, he explained, is someone who does something knowing they will be punished for it. I did not think about punishment. I just thought the data was wrong. But that humility, That refusal to accept the label of savior only made the story more powerful, because Stanislav Petrov was not a Hollywood hero. He was not fearless or righteous or larger than life. He was an ordinary man, a tired, middle-aged engineer with doubts, fears, and a mortgage, who happened to be in a concrete bunker on the night the world almost ended. And he had trusted his gut over the machine. That was all. But that was everything. The question that haunted him in his later years, Stanislav was asked again and again. The same question. What if you had been wrong? It was the question that haunted him. The question that kept him awake at night for decades. What if the missiles had been real? What if he had dismissed the warning, and 5 American warheads had detonated over Moscow, Leningrad, and Kiev? What if millions had died because he hesitated? In one interview, a journalist pressed him on this. "Do you ever regret your decision?" the journalist asked. Stanislav was silent for a long time. Then he said, "Every day." But it was not regret in the way most people understood it. It was not guilt. It was something deeper. The knowledge that he had carried an impossible burden, that he had been forced to make a choice no human being should ever have to make, because the system that put him in that bunker was designed to eliminate choice. It was designed to make the decision automatic, mechanical, inhuman. And when the system failed, it had placed the fate of the world in the hands of one man who had 12 minutes to decide whether to trust a machine or trust himself. And he had chosen himself. That was what haunted him. Not that he might have been wrong, but that the world had come so close to ending because of a system built by people who believed human beings could be removed from the equation. "We thought we could control it," Stanislav said in one of his final interviews. "We thought we could build machines that would keep us safe, but the machines almost killed us. And the only thing that saved us was the one thing we tried to eliminate: doubt." The world that forgot Stanislav Petrov died on May 19, 2017, at the age of 77. He died alone in his apartment in Friazino. His body was not discovered for several days. There was no state funeral, no military honors, no public memorial. The Russian government issued no statement. The Kremlin did not acknowledge his passing. A few international news outlets ran obituaries. Peace organizations posted tributes online. But for the most part, the world moved on quickly. Because by 2017, the Cold War felt like ancient history. The nuclear arsenals were still there, thousands of warheads, still aimed, still ready. But the fear had faded. A new generation had grown up never practicing nuclear drills, never watching public service announcements about fallout shelters, never lying awake at night wondering if tomorrow would come. The Cold War had become a story people told about their grandparents. And Stanislav Petrov, the man who had prevented it from becoming the end of the story, was quietly forgotten. The truth about heroes. There is a myth we tell ourselves about heroes. We imagine them as fearless, certain, righteous. We imagine them standing tall in the face of danger, making bold decisions without hesitation. We imagine them being rewarded, honored, remembered. But the real heroes of the Cold War were not like that. They were the people who hesitated when they were supposed to act. The people who questioned when they were supposed to obey. The people who chose doubt over certainty, even when doubt could destroy them. They were the submarine commanders who refused to launch nuclear torpedoes during the Cuban Missile Crisis. They were the radar operators who reported system malfunctions instead of missile strikes. They were the scientists who leaked documents about nuclear tests because they believed the world deserved to know. They were the translators who softened the rhetoric between superpowers to avoid misunderstandings that could have started wars. They were ordinary people in impossible situations, making small choices that kept the world from ending. And almost none of them were honored for it, because the systems they worked in did not reward doubt. They rewarded obedience. And when those systems collapsed, when the Cold War finally ended, the people who had saved the world were the ones most likely to be forgotten. Stanislav Petrov was one of those people. He did not want to be a hero. He did not ask for recognition. He simply wanted to live a quiet life, fix broken radios, and grow vegetables in his garden. But history placed him in a bunker on a September night in 1983 and gave him a choice that should never have been his to make. And he made it. Not because he was brave, not because he was noble, but because he was human. The machines we built, the night Stanislav Petrov died, There were approximately 15,000 nuclear warheads in the world. Most of them were still operational. Most of them were still aimed. And most of them were still connected to early warning systems. Satellites, radars, computers, designed to detect launches and trigger retaliation in minutes. The technology had improved since 1983. The sensors were more accurate. The computers were faster. The protocols were more refined. But the fundamental logic had not changed. We still lived under mutually assured destruction. We still believed that the only way to prevent nuclear war was to promise total annihilation in response. And we still built systems designed to remove human judgment from the process. Because human judgment, we believed, was too slow, too unreliable, too prone to error. And yet, on September 26, 1983, it was human judgment that saved us. It was Stanislav Petrov's doubt, his refusal to trust the machine, that prevented the world from ending. And that raises a question we still have not answered. What happens the next time the system fails? Because it will fail. Systems always do. Satellites will glitch. Radars will malfunction. Computers will misinterpret data. And somewhere, in a bunker or a submarine or a command center, a human being will be forced to make the same choice Stanislav made. Will they hesitate? Will they doubt? Or will they follow protocol? We do not know. And that is what makes Stanislav Petrov's story so terrifying. Because it proves that the world did not survive the Cold War because of good strategy or smart diplomacy or technological superiority. It survived because of luck, and because on one night, one man chose to lie. The last lesson. There is a photograph of Stanislav Petrov that was taken in 2004 when he visited the United Nations headquarters in New York. In the photo, he is standing in front of the General Assembly building, wearing a simple dark suit that looks slightly too big for him. His hair is gray, his face is lined with age. He is not smiling. Behind him, you can see the flags of member nations, the United States, Russia, China, France, the United Kingdom, all the countries that still possess nuclear weapons, all the countries that still rely on systems like the one Stanislav worked in. He looks small in that photograph, ordinary, unremarkable, but that is the point. The people who saved the world were not generals or presidents or diplomats. They were engineers, technicians, operators, ordinary people who happened to be in the right place at the wrong time and who chose humanity over procedure. And most of them, like Stanislav, paid a price for it. Because systems do not forgive doubt. Systems punish hesitation. And systems do not build monuments to the people who refuse to follow orders. But those are the people we should remember, not because they were perfect, not because they were fearless, but because they were human. And in a world built on the logic of machines, humanity was the only thing that could save us. Epilogue. The file that never closed. Somewhere in the archives of the Russian Ministry of Defense, there is a file marked Incident 8309-26, Serpukhov 15. It is a thin file. Most of the details are still classified. The few pages that have been declassified are heavily redacted. But buried in those pages is a single line, written in bureaucratic Russian, that tells you everything you need to know about what happened that night. Officer on duty reported system malfunction. No further action taken. That is all. No mention of 5 Phantom missiles. No mention of a decision that could have ended the world. No mention of Stanislav Petrov's name. Just a malfunction. A glitch. A footnote in a forgotten file. And maybe that is how it should be. Because the Cold War was full of moments like that. Moments where the world came within seconds of annihilation and no one outside a classified bunker ever knew. Moments where the machines failed and a human being had to decide whether to trust the screen or trust their gut. Moments where ordinary people became the last line of defense between civilization and oblivion. We do not know how many of those moments there were. We do not know how many Stanislav Petrovs there were. People who hesitated, who questioned, who lied to their superiors because the truth felt wrong. We do not know their names. We do not have their files. But they were there. And they are the reason we are still here. The silence we live in. If you are reading this, you are alive because of decisions you will never know about. You are alive because of radar operators who dismissed warnings, because of submarine commanders who refused to fire, Because of scientists who leaked secrets, because of translators who softened words, because of engineers who trusted their instincts over their orders. You are alive because the Cold War was full of moments where the system failed, and a human being chose doubt over certainty. And you will never know their names, because the systems they worked in did not reward them, the governments they served did not honor them, and the world they saved forgot them. Stanislav Petrov is one of the few we know about. But there were others, and there will be others, because as long as we build systems designed to end the world in minutes, there will be moments where those systems fail. And in those moments, we will need people who are willing to hesitate, to question, to refuse. We will need people who are willing to lie, not because lying is noble, but because sometimes doubt is the only thing standing between us and the end. The weight of silence. Stanislav Petrov never called himself a hero. He said he was just a man doing his job. But that humility, that quiet refusal to accept the myth of the savior, is what makes his story so important. Because he did not save the world through courage or righteousness. He saved it through hesitation, through doubt, through the simple human act of saying, "This does not feel right." And that is a lesson we have not learned. We still build systems designed to eliminate doubt. We still trust machines over people. We still believe that the way to prevent war is to make retaliation automatic, mechanical, certain. But Stanislav Petrov proved that certainty is dangerous. He proved that the only thing more dangerous than a system that fails is a system that never allows itself to be questioned. And he proved that the people who save the world are not the ones who follow orders. They are the ones who refuse. On September 26, 1983, the world did not end. Not because of diplomacy, not because of deterrence, not because the system worked, but because one man, in a concrete bunker beneath frozen soil, looked at a blinking red light and chose not to believe it. He had 12 minutes to decide. He chose doubt. And the world kept turning. Stanislav Petrov died in 2017, alone and forgotten. The Soviet Union never thanked him. The Russian government never acknowledged him, and most of the world never knew his name. But he saved us, all of us. And if stories like this make you reflect on how fragile everything really is, how close we came, how close we still are, then maybe his story deserves to be remembered. Because the Cold War is not over. The weapons are still there. The systems are still running. And somewhere right now in a bunker or a submarine or a command center, someone is watching a screen. And if that screen ever blinks red again, we will need another Stanislav Petrov, someone willing to hesitate, someone willing to doubt, someone willing to lie. And we can only hope they are there when we need them, because the next time, we might not be so lucky.